What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Sorry for the hair. There is one sentence from Vladimir Putin that sounds like a peace offer, but the more carefully you read it, the more it starts to look like the opposite of peace. Because on June 23rd, when Russian and international news agencies rushed to publish headlines saying that Russia was ready to talk with Ukraine, based on the Istanbul network framework, the real story was not the word talk, and it was not even the word Istanbul, but everything Putin quietly attached to that sentence after the headline had already been written. This is exactly how political language works, especially when it comes from the Kremlin. Because one phrase gives journalists a clean headline, another phrase gives diplomats something vague to discuss. And somewhere deeper inside the paragraph, there is the real condition, the real demand, and the thing that tells you whether we are looking at an actual path towards ending the war, or just another performance of Putin where Moscow pretends to be reasonable, however much he wants people to see him reasonable, while demanding something no Ukrainian government could ever accept. Putin did not simply say that Russia was willing to negotiate, because he said negotiations should be based on the Istanbul agreements, the modalities discussed in Anchorage, the reality on the ground, and the principles he laid out in his foreign ministry address just a couple of years ago. Which means this was not just one single peace proposal, but a whole political package. And once you open that surprise package, the gift, the friendly sounding headline starts to completely fall apart. So today, we need to unpack what Putin actually said, why the Istanbul reference became such a convenient distraction, what the Alaska summit with Donald Trump really seems to have produced, why Marco Rubio's comments matter, why Dmitry, Medvedev, Ushakov, Peskov, Lavrov, and even Alexei Arestovich, all of them became part of this single story, and why the so-called reality on the ground may now be turning against the very man who keeps using that phrase as his main argument. As always, guys, if you want to see these episodes in early access, get an additional chapter at the end, and show the best support possible for our work, please consider checking our Patreon, the link is down below, and we have thousands of members there. There is a free trial, so you can see it for yourself if you want to proceed with the membership. Thanks much, now let's begin. When Putin says Russia is ready for peace talks, the natural reaction is to ask whether something has changed, whether Moscow is now becoming more flexible, or whether we are finally seeing the beginning of a diplomatic opening. But with Putin, the first rule is that you never stop just at the headline reading, because the headline is usually where the performance begins, not where the truth is hidden. Once again, on June 23rd, just around a week ago, Putin was not even supposed to be talking mainly about Ukraine, because he brought up the war during just a cabinet regular briefing focused on healthcare, education, and document automation. Which already tells you something about his style, which is already becoming way too familiar, because he often uses just routine government meetings to just suddenly insert a much larger message, mostly war-related, as if the real audience is not the ministers on the screen, but the Russian regular public, foreign leaders, and every newsroom waiting for a good quote. He began by saying that the situation was supposedly deteriorating for the Kiev regime militarily, that Ukraine was losing more territory, and that Russian troops were methodically taking new places one by one. And this was not a new line from him, because on May 22nd of this year, he also said something very similar when speaking to the Russian military, claiming that Ukrainian actions were caused by battlefield failures, forced mobilization, and the alleged collapse of Ukraine's positions. That framing obviously matters, because it creates the emotional foundation for everything that comes next, since Putin is not presenting negotiations as a mutual search or compromise, but as something that should happen only because Russia believes it is advancing, Ukraine is weakening, and the West has supposedly failed to change the direction of this entire war, which in Putin's understanding means that when he says peace talks, he's not speaking of the language of compromise, he is speaking of the language of pressure. Then comes the line that made headlines around the world, where he said Russia was willing to hold peace talks with Ukraine, and that talks should be built upon the agreements reached in Istanbul, which were, according to him, initiated by the Ukrainian delegation. And at first glance, that even sounds like he is simply returning to the negotiations of spring 2022, one of the first ones. But that is exactly the bait. because Istanbul is the war that makes everyone debate the past instead of reading the rest of the present statement. The moment Istanbul appears, the public conversation becomes extremely predictable, because some people ask whether peace was possible in 2022, others ask who disrupted it, others argue about whether Boris Johnson at that time, Kyiv, Moscow, Washington, or somebody else ended the deal and made the war continue. And now suddenly everyone is fighting over history, while Putin has already moved on to the real conditions he wants people to miss. And that is exactly where the story begins to change. Because after mentioning Istanbul, Putin did not stop there, and the rest of the sentence is where the real message starts. Now here is the important part, because Putin did not say negotiations should be based only on Istanbul, and he did not say Russia was ready to return to the spring 2022 framework, as if nothing had happened since then. Because after Istanbul, he added 3 more new things. The modalities discussed in Anchorage, the reality on the ground, and the principles he outlined during his foreign ministry address just a couple of years ago. All that may sound like boring diplomatic language, and in most cases just it is. But in Kremlin's politics, that is exactly where the meaning is usually hidden, because every extra phrase changes the offer, and every additional condition expands Russia's demand beyond the simple headline that says Moscow is ready to talk. Which is exactly why focusing only on Istanbul is like reading the title of a contract and ignoring the pages that actually contain the terms. The most important reference is Putin's foreign ministry address from June 14, 2024, because that was when he publicly laid out conditions that were not a compromise at all, but a maximalist demand packaged as a peace proposal. And those conditions included Ukraine, as you guys already know, withdrawing its troops from Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, as Russia calls them, and even then from the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions, not only from areas Russia currently controls, but from the entire territory of those regions within their administrative borders from the time they were part of Ukraine. That seemingly small, which is a huge, to be honest, detail, changes everything, because Russia does not fully control all of those regions, yet Putin's condition requires Ukraine to leave territory that Russia has not yet taken, if ever will. Which means the demand is not recognize the current front line, and it's not even freeze the conflict where it stands as of right now, but rather a demand for Ukraine to literally hand over additional land before negotiations can even properly begin. On top of that, Putin said Kyiv would need to officially abandon plans to join NATO, and once Kyiv declared that it was ready to begin a real withdrawal from those regions and officially notified Russia that it was dropping NATO ambitions, only then would Moscow and Putin issue an order to stop active operations and begin negotiations. Which means the ceasefire itself would not come first, because in Putin's version, Ukraine would need to make enormous concessions before talks even start. He also tied this to the recognition of Crimea, Sevastopol, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia as part of Russia, and said these provisions should be fixed in binding international agreements, which would also imply the West eventually lifting sanctions from Russia. So when he pretty much casually points back to those so-called principles in 2026, he is not opening a new door, he's pointing back at a locked door and pretending Ukraine is the one refusing to walk through it. And once you understand that, the next reference in his statement, Anchorage, becomes even more revealing. The next part is where most people mess up, because for months Russian officials kept talking about the spirit of Anchorage, as if the Trump-Putin-Alaska summit had created some kind of diplomatic foundation, I don't know, secret understanding, or an official framework for a future deal. But the more information comes out, the more it looks like Anchorage did not produce an agreement at all. I mean, it happened almost a year ago, and so what? Putin himself used careful wording when he referred to the modalities discussed in Anchorage, and that phrase matters because discussing modalities is not the same thing as reaching an agreement, just like sitting in the same room is not the same thing as solving a crisis. And when politicians want to make failure sound meaningful, they often use words that suggest process without admitting that nothing concrete was achieved. The summit itself already looked strange at the time, because the presidential meeting came to an abrupt close, the planned full group negotiations were reportedly called off, and Russian officials such as Defense Minister Andrei Belousov and Finance Minister Anton Siluanov ended up making what looked like a largely pointless trip to Alaska, because the broader delegation format never became the serious negotiating process many people expected. For a long time, the actual content of the Trump-Putin conversation could only be guessed from leaks and scattered comments. But then, Secretary of the State Marco Rubio finally made one thing clearer when he said that Russia wanted the entirety of Donetsk to be turned over to them, along with some other things that he did not explain in detail. And even that one sentence tells you why the talks likely went nowhere. Because demanding all of Donetsk, while not fully controlling it, means demanding territory Ukraine, once again, still controls. Then the notorious Dmitry Medvedev added another piece on February 2nd, when he said that during the Alaska summit, Russia had doubled down on the claims Putin made in June 2024 during his foreign ministry address. And yes, as we all know, Medvedev is not always the most careful or influential or respected voice in Russian politics, but in this case he is one of the only Russian officials who actually described what Moscow's position was in Anchorage. If Medvedev's description is accurate, then the Alaska summit was not a serious attempt to find middle ground, but another attempt to repackage Putin's June 2024 ultimatum. And that would explain why the full negotiations did not continue, why the summit failed to produce a visible outcome, and why both sides later had incentives to avoid calling it a failure too loudly. For Trump, admitting the summit failed would have been politically uncomfortable, because his entire public style is built around presenting meetings as victories, successes, and strong personal achievements. Well, for Putin, the spirit of Anchorage was useful because it allowed Moscow to imply that America had already accepted some Russian framework, even if no agreement actually existed, just because Putin and Trump met. But now Putin's own wording weakens that story, because by saying modalities discussed, he basically confirms that Anchorage was a discussion, not a deal. And this destroys the idea that Putin and Trump secretly carved up Ukraine behind closed doors. And once Anchorage stops looking like just a hidden breakthrough, we are all left with a much simpler explanation. Putin was offered ways to negotiate, but he kept returning to demands that no Ukrainian leadership could ever accept. Let's now focus here, because there is something deeper going on, because the strangest part of this story is not that Putin makes impossible demands, but that he keeps making them even when the alternative is becoming more expensive for Russia itself. And this is where Alexei Arestovich becomes a very interesting figure in this conversation. Arestovich, you might remember him being active in the very beginning of the war, who once convinced Yulia Latina that Putin was likely heading towards a strategic win. Arestovich is Ukrainian, by the way, and who used to believe that there was room to find common ground with the Kremlin, has now publicly admitted that he overestimated the sanity and good reason of Putin and the rest of Russia's leadership. Finally. And so his latest comments point to the realization that Moscow does not simply want a better deal, because Moscow may not want a realistic deal at all. His point was that many of Russia's stated security concerns were almost entirely addressed in possible peace formulas, and according to his description, Trump had offered the kind of a gold card package that included coordinated global action, projects worth hundreds of billions of dollars, re-legitimization, and sanctions relief, while Europe also wanted to help broker a deal and offer benefits in exchange for negotiations. But instead of seeing those offers as an opportunity, Moscow appeared to interpret them as weakness, which is a critical psychological point, because if the Kremlin believes every concession is proof that the other side is afraid, then any negotiation becomes completely impossible, since every offer only encourages Moscow to ask for more. This helps explain why Putin keeps using the idea of a Russian offensive as justification for rejecting a freeze along the current line of contact, because in his public version of reality, Ukraine is collapsing, Russia is advancing, and therefore Moscow has no reason to stop now. But in practical terms, this could mean spending weeks or even months trying to grind through Konstantinivka, a town of approximately 70,000 people, only to then spend another year fighting from Drushkivka, a town of 50,000 people. And this is where Putin's reality so-called on the ground phrase becomes almost ironic, because if reality means the current military situation, then freezing the conflict along the current line of contact would itself be accepting reality. But that is not what Putin means when he says reality, because for him, reality seems to mean not what exists today, but what he believes Russia is entitled to demand tomorrow. That is why his peace conditions are not designed around the actual front line, but around his political map, where Crimea, Sevastopol, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia all must be treated as Russian territories, even if parts of those territories are not under full Russian control, and even if legal recognition from Ukraine and the international community is practically impossible. No, I mean, just think about it. No Ukrainian government could ever remove those regions from its constitution and survive politically. And no serious international coalition is likely to legitimize those annexations as the price of a ceasefire, which Putin almost certainly understands. And that is exactly why these demands function less like a negotiation platform and more just like a built-in excuse to continue. And while Putin continues, the costs are no longer staying neatly contained on the battlefield, because the final part of today's story is about what happens when the pressure comes back into Russia itself. Here is the part that changes the whole picture, because while Putin talks about reality on the ground as if it is only just a map of Ukrainian territory, Russia is now facing a different kind of reality inside its own system. And that reality includes fuel shortages, infrastructure pressure, logistical problems, and a Crimea peninsula that we spoke about in previous episode that now looks much less like the symbol of triumph it once was. According to earlier reports, dozens of Russian regions have introduced gasoline rationing, vehicles are lining up at the gas pumps, and shortly after the serious attack on the Moscow oil refinery, several weeks ago at this point, Ukraine struck 2 more oil refineries in the Bashkortostan, while in Voronezh, Ukraine even used cruise missiles against a local semiconductor factory, which means the war is no longer something the Kremlin can present only as a distant frontline progress. This matters a lot because the 2014 annexation of Crimea was once treated as the peak of Putin's political success, the foundation of the so-called Crimean consensus, the moment when many Russians rallied around the state and the Kremlin sold the idea that history had been corrected, strength had been restored, and Putin had delivered a national victory without paying the full price. But now, Crimea is increasingly difficult to access for tourists, fuel and power supplies are under pressure, and what used to be presented as a crown jewel can start looking more like a burden. Because territory that requires constant protection, constant supply, constant sacrifice, constant military presence, all this can slowly turn from a trophy into a white elephant. This is where Putin's refusal to accept a realistic deal becomes more dangerous for Russia itself, because according to the logic of the original analysis, there were opportunities to stop earlier, maybe a year ago, maybe 6 months ago, maybe even just 1 month ago. But every time the Kremlin seems to choose continuation over compromise, the price of continuation rises. The front line does not move at the speed of Putin's speeches, because he may speak as if he is General Guderian entering Belgium in 1940, but the actual military reality is slower, more exhausting, and way more costly, with once again towns like Konstantinivka, Drushkivka representing not some cinematic movie-style breakthrough, but the possibility of another long struggle over places that still do not deliver the political result he claims to be chasing. At the same time, Ukraine is signaling that the offer to freeze the conflict along the current front line of contact may not remain available forever, because a revitalized and empowered Ukrainian government can also decide that if Moscow refuses every realistic option, that the diplomatic window should not be treated as endless. Even Trump, after spending a year and a half trying to build some kind of relationship with Putin, appears to have moved closer to the conclusion that cooperation with the Russian leadership is completely pointless, because if Trump truly believed Ukraine was the main side derailing the talks, as he did in the very beginning, we likely would have seen him publicly attack Kiev much more aggressively, once again something what he did in the very beginning, when he met with Zelensky in White House, you remember that, right? But instead, the latest signals suggest that the problem is being understood differently. And that brings us back to the original June 23rd statement, because the real story was never that Putin said he was ready for talks, but that the conditions attached to those talks show why those talks are not happening. It shows that Putin still believes time is on his side. Even as the fuel crisis spreads across Russian regions, oil refineries in Bashkortostan and the Moscow oil refinery come under pressure, Voronezh faces strikes on strategic industry, Crimea becomes harder to sustain, and the supposed quote-unquote reality on the ground becomes more complicated than the Kremlin wants to admit. Maybe the most important lesson here is that in politics, especially in wartime diplomacy, the dangerous sentence is rarely the loudest one, because the loudest sentence becomes the headline, while the quiet one materializes after it became the actual policy. And in this case, the quiet conditions tell us that Putin is not offering a realistic off-ramp. He is offering the same maximalist demand with a more diplomatic cover. So guys, if you found this breakdown useful, please make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, because stories like this are exactly why we need to look just beyond the headlines. Read the full statement, read the articles, and understand the political machinery behind the words. Please don't forget about our Patreon, links are down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you on Wednesday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.